Welcome to another series of Tidbits. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen. Our topic this time is the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible, and we will begin in chapter 1. Today we are looking at chapter 1 and 2, but we will also just take a brief view of the book as a whole. It begins like this: These are the names of the sons of Israel, who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family. And then you have a list of the 12 sons of Jacob. Altogether, 70, probably 70 males. There would have been more in the households. When it says family, it could be household. This is where we begin, and that beginning takes us back to Genesis. In chapter 46, verse 8, we have the similar introduction. These are the names of the sons of Jacob. And there are other features of this chapter that reminds us of Genesis. But for this, I'll just point out that when you move to chapter 6, verse 16, you have this similar sentence. These are the names of, and these two texts frame the section, the first 6 chapters basically, in the center of which you find God speaking to Moses at the burning bush in the desert. And that leads to a more overall look at Exodus. Exodus is a book where God reveals himself to deliver Israel. And there are 3 big occasions. The first one in chapter 3, when God speaks to Moses at the burning bush and represents himself as Yahweh. The second time is when God speaks to the people from Mount Sinai. And finally, in chapter 40, God visits his people and takes his position in the tabernacle, in the most holy. Now, in between, of course, God acts on behalf of his people. We see his finger, we see his shadow, we see the pillar of fire. And it is worth noticing every time you read a historical account like this, that sometimes there are explicit statements about God. That is, statements moving beyond mere history. They are explanatory and they're worth noticing, and we will have a few in the first 2 chapters. The book takes us from this small group of people in Egypt to a large multitude who has been led out into the wilderness. The book begins with a feeling of being deserted by God, but ends with deliverance into the desert. In the following verses, let's read. In the following verses, you have a reminder of the creation in Genesis. I'll read from New International Version, verse 6 and 7. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Now, for any reader in the past who read this in Hebrew, there are a number of expressions that would have reminded him or her about the creation account in Genesis 1. There are in Hebrew 7 expressions, not always detectable as clearly in translation, 7 expressions that you find also in Genesis 1. So that way, the reader is told that God is now about to create something new. That new would be the people of God, the entity of Israel, as we come to know it. And the story goes on. Then a new king, it says in verse 8, who did not know about Joseph, came to power in Egypt. Now, saying he did not know about Joseph may not be quite correct. He didn't respect or acknowledge him, but he probably very likely had heard about him. And when they says a new king, we probably need to understand that here it is not simply a matter of replacing one king with another. This is a new dynasty. Historically, very likely, a replacement that took place when the Semitic people of the Hyksos was overthrown and the indigenous Egyptians took over. And because the Israelites were Semites too, the new dynasty with its leaders were skeptical. Now we need to know something else too. We know who the kings of Egypt were. They were the pharaohs. But originally the term pharaoh meant the great house and was the name for not only his palace but the empire of the Egyptian rulers. Around the time in the new dynasty, as it is called in history, the name or the title pharaoh was used also about the person. But in Exodus, there is no mention of the specific name of any of the Egyptian rulers. It is just Pharaoh. And that is significant, and we will have to see that. Now, this new dynasty, a new pharaohs, they were suspicious about the growth and the potential power of the Israelites. The king said to his people, "The Israelites has become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies. Fight with us and leave the country," which of course would mean that they lost the good slaves or workers, potentially. Now, was the king right? He may not have been, but his speech was propaganda. He had a need to build up the picture of the Israelites as an enemy so that he could marshal against them. And that's what they did. The Israelites were put to slavery, hard work. They were oppressed with forced labor. It didn't work as hoped for. They still became more and more numerous. So the Pharaoh decided to call the midwives, those who were leading out, there might have been far more, these are the leading midwives, to advise them and ask them to deal with the Hebrew boys. The baby boys that were to be born should be killed. And here's an interesting thing. The midwives, who would have been normal workers of the time, they are actually named Puah and Shifra. Pharaoh is not. And they belong to a group of women, 12 altogether, who played an important role in bringing Moses to where he came to be as the leader of the people. So women in Exodus is a story in itself. They asked that they were to look at the stones, 2 stones, and see whether it was a boy or a girl that was born. And just a note, there's a long discussion about what these 2 stones meant. Some would say those are probably the testicles. Others would say these are 2 stones where they laid the babies afterward. And there are a number of explanations, which means that we cannot be sure. But what we can be sure is that the midwives were clever and wise people who, as it is said, feared God, and they didn't do what the Pharaoh had ordered them to do. The first strike in history? Maybe. But when Pharaoh discovered that they did not obey him, he called them in, and he would have been angry. Why are you not doing it? Why are you not killing the babies? And then explained, the midwives, the Hebrew people, the Israelites, are so alive, so strong, that before we arrive, they have already delivered the child. The order the death decree still went out with even more severity. But then it is said, and that's worth noticing, this is said something about God. In verse 20, so God was kind to the midwives, and because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. So certainly it is more than ordinary history that you could find in a history textbook. Now the author, inspired, tells us something about God's feelings, God's emotions, and God's actions. And from that event, we move down to the specific story about Moses. Chapter 2. Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him from 3 months. And for the sake of devotional or homily, I would sometimes say, what would she have done if she did not find him to be a lovely boy? Now, most women love their babies. But there is in Hebrew an expression here that also reminds us of creation. Because what is really said is, when she saw that he was good. You remember? When God saw and it was good. This is once more a reminder of the creation. Something new and lasting is going to happen. And then you have the story. The first woman, Jochebed, named later. The sister, Miriam, also named later. And the daughter of Pharaoh, they come down to the river Nile to properly have a ritual bath. The Nile was a god. It was a ceremony. And she sees the little ark where the baby is lying. She brings him in by help of a maid, and she sees a baby who is crying. In the middle of it all is Moses. And then the story returns like a reversed parallel, a sandwich, and Miriam pops up, the mother pops up, gets her child back, and finally, in verse 10, he is grown up, weaned off, enough to become adopted as the daughter of the Pharaoh's daughter in Egypt. The story moves very quickly next. And a lot of politics probably lie behind what happens. Moses is suddenly 40 years old. He walks out as a prince of Egypt, and he sees an Egyptian beat up, kill an Israelite, a Hebrew. He kills the Hebrew. He kills the Egyptian. The next day, believing that nobody notices it, he is out there again, and he is trying to stop an infight between two Hebrews. One of them turns to him and says, "Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" And suddenly Moses realizes that he is discovered. He is therefore out of favor with the court. He has to flee. He flees to Midian. And the story becomes very short. After having these details about his birth almost drawn out of the Nile. This is almost legendary. A theme that you often find. You have 60, 70 years where Moses ends up in Midian. He's helping some young ladies getting water. That is another theme that you find repeated through Genesis and Exodus. He is marrying one of them, daughter of the priest Jethro. And here almost the story ends so far, but we are closing with the last verses in chapter 2. In chapter 2, it is said at the end of this section, during that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. God had compassion. He saw what happened. He remembered, because now he's going to act. This is where the story is more than a story. It's a revelation about God's intervention, and what God did will be the topic for our next tidbit when we look at chapters 3 and 4 in Exodus. Thank you for listening, and welcome back.